Good evening. We're back in the shop with tonight's project. I'm Reinhold von Gleer, and what you're looking at is some of the steel we made last week. The bright colored steel is the steel that we created, high carbon steel from mild steel through the process of cementation or carburization. And what we have is the material for a Norwegian Seax. That's going to be tonight's project. And we'll see how far we get. The first thing we have to do is material prep. In this case, with surface prep. The steel has been sitting for about a week. We've got to make sure that it's bright and spotless so that our weld can be free from any potential contaminants. Even the untreated mild steel has to be sanded the same way. There we have the color difference. I think that's a nice little bit of contrast. Even though the steel looks clean, it still needs to be cleaned with acetone or rubbing alcohol, some kind of solvent. You'll see how much actually comes off the material that would have been contaminants inside the weld. You see? And now we're going to bind this up in preparation for the forge weld. I've got a little bit of baling wire here, and that is probably the most traditional method of adhering material together for a forge weld. But the problem is that baling wire now is kind of low quality. I've been struggling to find any kind of decent baling wire, and it snapped on me. So we're going to go with the old reliable, the MIG welder. You'll have to excuse the anachronism, but sometimes needs must. Now we're just going for tacking welds here. We're not trying to do anything fancy like a zero atmosphere weld. I did consider it, but I thought it would be more useful to show a weld with traditional flux. And here's our billet. Our pattern billet, and here's a file as additional donor material. Now the file is very hard right now, so we're going to leave it in the fire for a little while and let it soften up. Here I'm using Iron Mountain forging flux, which I highly recommend. It's absolutely fantastic. There's the nice and hot file. We'll set that off to the side for a while. Come back to it later. I'm setting the weld. I'll be setting it a couple of times with light hammer blows on the anvil. It doesn't take a hard strike, and you can see the flux erupting out of the weld seams. That's a good sign. It's also necessary at this stage to keep the welds clean, just in case you might get any separation. You always want to do 3 welding steps. To tack, to set, and to blend. Or in this case, to set a little bit harder. I'm using the hydraulic press for the 3rd welding step. And in dealing with any kind of laminated material, you're going to want to work as hot as you can, especially if you have to work against the plane of the weld. And we'll get to that a little bit later, because that's exactly what we will be doing. I'm switching the plates out from a flattening plate to a fullering plate, and that'll let the drawing process go a little bit more quickly. You'll see that here. I think we got some pretty good movement out of that. But for the next step, we go back to the flattening plates, because we don't want to get our piece too distorted. And you can see here I'm starting to forge against the plane of the weld to draw out the length and to make sure that we don't get our billet too wide. Because ultimately what we want is some long square bars so that we can do our twists. The primary patterning in the migration era through the Viking Age was twisting. In fact, there are even Roman gladiuses that show a twisted pattern. We think this was probably incidental. Obviously, smiths did know that there was a pattern in the steel, and they pursued it. They wrote about it. They called it the serpent in the steel, among other poetic phrases. But we think that the twist was probably initially a proof of good construction, a proof of high-quality material, because with laminated material, which all primitive iron and steel was, if the forge weld was conducted improperly, or if there was too much impurity inside the metal, then twisting would reveal those flaws and open up the seams. So bars that were sold with twists were essentially proof of quality, and then those bars could be welded up with the twists intact, and that would appear in the steel. And it doesn't take long for an interesting artifact to become artistic. Right now I'm marking the middle point of our square billet. This is going to be the patterned billet. And I boomered the video. I lost that whole twisting segment, but what I'm showing you here is a shearing fracture, or at least what I thought was a potential shearing fracture in the twist. As soon as you begin a twisting process, there will be points on your twist that will go faster and some will go slower. And if you want a nice even twist, it's very difficult to work out artfully. So if something starts to over twist, the best thing that you can do is stop. But I didn't stop fast enough, and I'm pointing out that even though we forged that out, there's still a crack there. Yep. And I'm just going to go ahead and break that off. And we'll grind it down and we'll work with what we have left. If you ever have any kind of weld failure, the best thing to do is to grind it out, whether that's a failed lamination, whether that's a cold shut or an inclusion. Grind it out and start from clean metal, and just work with what you have. And now we're going to try the twist on the other side. So we're going back to that middle point that I marked, and using my twisting tool, we're going to be twisting in the opposite direction from what we had last time. Not that that was on video, but so you know. That way we can have a herringbone pattern in the steel eventually. And I think up here, yeah, you can see the over twisting begin to start. So one of the things that you have to do if you're starting to over twist is either cool down that section or heat up the section that was under twisted. And that's what my brother, shop assistant, is doing right now. Also, twisting wrenches are notoriously finicky, really annoying to work with. Everyone has as good a solution as they can come up with, and none of them are really good. Here I'm going back to the original section, and I'm twisting in the opposite direction from what you saw. And I'm just going to try and tighten up that twist. Since my fractured section is no longer with us, we've ground that out. We're going to tighten up the twists that we have, and we'll see how evenly this divides. And you can see the middle point right there. I think it turned out pretty nice. Now we're going to forge that back down, because we do need square bars so that they can weld up on top of each other, and that's what we're doing right here. I think it came out very nice. I think here what I decided to do was make my squares actually a little bit rectangular, so that when I went to do the final forge weld I had a little more surface area, and when I drew out the profile of the knife I would have more room before I started distorting the twist. And here we can see the twist. It's not a very bold pattern right now, but that's okay. The pattern will increase in vividness once the material is hard. That has to do with the crystalline structure of the steel, which changes through heat treating. And right now we're going back to the file that we started with and set aside. Since we've taken the trouble to remove its heat treating, it's very much easier to grind down to flat. You don't have to flatten something like a file, but you risk cold shuts if you don't. So now we're on to making the blade steel portion of the knife. And again, this is some of the steel that we went through the cementation process with, the steel that we made into high carbon steel. And we have a little bit of known good donor material in the form of this was a Nicholson black diamond file. And that's a very period process, not necessarily using files as a parent material, but using known good and no longer necessary pieces of iron as a moderating factor when adding new steel. Because we don't know the characteristics of the steel that we made. It may be very high carbon steel, overly high carbon, or it might be medium carbon and not as much carbon as we need. Now, honestly, from the spark test, I think we have some really good stuff. But regardless, either way, the material of the file will be a moderating influence and should probably improve it one way or the other. So we're making a simple little billet here, and as soon as we get it all welded up, we'll toss it in the forge. No, we're back to the patterned material, and what we're actually going to do here is fold that over and begin to make the stack of the blade. So it's cut almost all the way through. And we'll just fold that over. And that's what we will be welding up. That was cut right on the transition point in between the two twist directions. You can, of course, do that hot. We did that while the metal was heating up. Again, I'm using black diamond forging flux, or excuse me, Iron Mountain forging flux. And I can't recommend this stuff enough. Compared to borax, there's no comparison. It's so much cleaner. It allows the welds to set so much easier. It's very difficult to explain how much easier it is to use this flux in comparison to borax, but you really ought to take a chance on it if you're doing any kind of welding in the forge at all. As you saw, I went ahead and I set the welds with a couple of heats on the anvil, and then I'm moving over to the forge. And those welds set very nicely. We've got a very contiguous material. And from here on, we're going to be forging in both directions, in the plane of the weld and perpendicular to the plane of the weld. And that means those seams are very likely to want to open up. So we're going to have to be careful with that. We're going to have to work hot. We're going to have to work carefully. We're probably going to have to reflux a number of times. Here I've got the fullering die on the billet, and I'm forging both ways. And I did see the seams on just the very edge start to open up, but no, it came out very nicely. We were able to get a very nice, clean billet, and here they are. Here are our 3 pieces of parent metal, and next we're going to try and forge a Seax. Thank you so much.